So please join me in welcoming Lisa.
Hello, hopefully this is working okay, and I'm going to try my best to keep it near my face, but just flag me if I don't. My name's Lisa Taniguchi, and I'm going to be talking about my first font, and so this is all about the joys and frustrations of discovering type design as a lettering artist. So I am a lettering artist, designer, muralist, and amateur type designer. I've been working as a designer for like 10 years now and have been doing lettering art and murals for about 3 or 4. And so, some of my client work spans across the world and clients like McDonalds, AT&T, etc. And I've also done murals, and so the one on the right is my first mural, so it was with Vancouver Mural Festival in 2021, and the one on the left is through YVR, and so that was last summer, my most recent one, so always a fun time. And I also do a lot of personal work through lettering, so, various thoughts, feelings, put it down in letters, and so I have a lot of experience drawing letters, and I remember starting to get comments on my posts being like, hey, this would be a great font, or what font is this for a custom lettering piece? And I also had peers and friends asking like, oh, would you ever consider making a font? And so for a long time I didn't, because it felt really intimidating. I feel like as a designer, type design is seems very complicated, very intimidating, hard to get into. But eventually I did. And so immediately I was kind of like, okay, what kind of font do I want to start with? And I do a lot of reverse contrast script. That's kind of my go-to, my signature. And I really wanted to try to make that into a font. It seemed really exciting and a cool challenge, but scripts as a first font are not really wise. They're not very easy to do. They can be very complicated, and they're just more challenging than your typical. And so instead, I decided to do something a little bit more manageable, an all caps display font. So the one on the bottom, hopefully people can see it in the back, but it's those letters are the ones that I decided to take inspiration from. And so, smaller glyph set can be more playful, more loose, more interesting. So I started to approach the project just like I would any other lettering project. I started sketching out all the different letters from A to Z on my iPad. And eventually, once those letters felt reasonable, I took them into glyphs and started vectoring out these letters. And I'm going to show you the first export of this font. It is not pretty, I am warning you. This was it. There was no spacing. You can tell that I didn't really know what I was doing. And when I was looking at the letters individually on glyphs, they looked good. There was something. I realized when I exported the OTF file that I wasn't paying attention to how the letters are playing as a system, which is what fonts are all about, right? And so at this time, I actually was talking to James Edmondson of Ono Typeco. If you don't know him, you should. He's a really talented type designer, lettering artist, graphic designer, type foundry founder. And he knew that I was working on my first font and had offered to say, hey, like if you ever need anything, video call, any feedback, let me know. And so I took him up on that. And so we had a video call. The first thing that he said was, send me your font file. And I was like, oh no, I have to send him this. I was a little mortified, but I did it anyways. And so he opened it up into RoboFont and just shared his screen and started commenting on it, started like basically making changes live, letter by letter. And obviously like the feedback itself was great, but being able to see that window into how a type designer actually thinks about letters and thinks about the thought process of all these little decisions that goes into forming a letter that belongs in a system was something that I was really missing because I was coming at it from lettering. And with lettering, you don't have to worry about a lot of that stuff. So it was really illuminating, to say the least. It was a really huge light bulb moment of, oh, this is what type design really is. You have to really think about how everything connects. It's not just about these individual letters. It's about what are the concepts, the ideas, the rules, the patterns that you want to shine through these pieces. So I went back to my really bad font file, and the first thing I did was I made it straight. James was like, you know, drawing on straight angles is way easier than slants, and I said, yes, that makes sense. So that was one of the first things that I did after the crit. I also just used some simple spacing. So this is a bit technical, but he was like, one of the things that I learned was you can just use 20, 40, 60. So you can use 20 for the round ones. So, you know, an O can have 20 to bring it tighter since it has more space on the top and the bottom. For the left hand of the F, for example, you can use 60 because you need a bit more space for those. And then for everything else, you can use 40. Very simple spacing just to get you started. But that was something that was really helpful for me. And so here you can see the before and the after. Much better just really between those two tweaks. And so with that initial crit, I think one of the things, again, that was really eye-opening and really helped to shift my mentality from thinking about things from a lettering perspective to type design was thinking about things as a system, not as individual letters, which sounds obvious now, but in retrospect, it wasn't back then. So I think, you know, really for me coming at it from a lettering perspective, you know, thinking about what are the best rules that I have, the best patterns that I can pull out of my font, and then apply it to everything in a cohesive way. And with type design, it's kind of like less is more. You can't just cram in a bunch of flourishes and stuff like you can with lettering. And so it really became, what are the best rules and how can I best apply those across the system, rather than what are the best letters that I can design individually. And so after I kind of had that mentality shift, I started going into iterative cycles, so proof, review, revise. So with each proof, I kind of had a slightly different thing that I was trying to work on. So earlier on, it was like individual letters, like, okay, some of these letters aren't working. And then towards the end, it's like, okay, how can I get the spacing perfect amongst all these letters and potential character pairings and stuff like that. So one of these early iterations was this, so the before and after, and again, hopefully people in the back can see the bottom part of the slide. But for example, the G at the top there, it had this weird like angled thing going on, but you don't see it anywhere else in that font. So getting rid of that was one of the first things that I did. And I will just take you through some of the specific letters. So for this font, because it's a reverse contrast, the straight angles were really challenging because with straight angle, it's really hard to get weight on the top and bottom, as you can see here. And so that was a really big challenge. So instead, I took some of the curves that was going on in some of the other letters and applied them here. And so bringing in the weight was a lot easier once those curves started happening. And so the weight distribution was just so much better. Another before and after was these letters, so fixing up the proportions of letters was another thing that I wanted to do early on, so PRS, and so really just like bringing them in. And after I fixed the S, I couldn't look at this one anymore, just the curves were not working. And then for this one, EF said, so the E and the F had a pretty subtle change, but you can kind of tell that like the distribution of weight across those letters just feel better and more balanced. And for the Z, I actually liked the before one more, but again, like the rounded exterior corners weren't showing up anywhere else in the font. So realistically, those had to go. And even though like looking at the Z still kind of looks a little bit awkward and odd to me, it worked in the font, so that's all that mattered. Another before and after. So this was before and this was after the tweaks. And you know, to some people that might look very similar. But in particular, like if you look at the word funky, the N looks so heavy compared to the K and the Y. And if you flip to the after, the weight just feels a lot more balanced across those letters. And so it was starting to get into a better place. This was one of the later iterations, so the before and after actually are not that different. And so here's kind of like a kind of comparison. So at this point, it was really tweaking some of the weight to try to, again, maintain consistency across this system that I was creating. And it was focused a lot more on spacing, which you don't necessarily get a sense of here. And I'm not actually going to go into a whole lot because it's a big can of worms and I still don't really know what I'm doing there. So yeah, and then after I couldn't bear to look at my font anymore in glyphs, I released it. So it released April 1st last year, so almost out for a year. And it was really fun to see what people made with it. So a nice little full circle moment was on the top right, that's it being used in SADMAG. And the initial lettering that was inspiration for this font actually was from the lettering piece for SAD magazine. So I thought that was a really nice moment. And then it's also been used in like Uniqlo, which is kind of crazy to me. So yeah, it's been pretty fun to see what people create. So kind of one of the takeaways from that whole experience was designing fonts fundamentally changed how I think, see, and work with letters. So that can, again, retrospect, that's pretty obvious, but when I do lettering now, it's just totally different. And so really thinking about the differences between, lettering and design fonts, like with lettering, you can make these like bold choices because you're only looking at the stuff that's right in front of you. You don't have to think about, well, how else might this show up somewhere else? Because you're just designing that one particular thing. Whereas for type design, like Franco said, you have to really think about the user. Who's actually using this product? Because at the end of the day, it's just a tool for somebody else to use. And so the same, like, if you think about how you apply or achieve a certain look and feel to lettering, it's a lot more straightforward because you have ultimate control. But with type design, especially for me coming from lettering, it was a big exercise in restraint because you have to be a lot more considerate and calculated in terms of where you add style and where you don't, and kind of have to be a lot more cognizant of that. And so I've talked about my first font. I'm going to rewind a little bit to early in the presentation when I said, doing a script font for your first font is not a smart idea. So I've decided to do it as my second font. So this is the list that as it stands right now, just the lowercase, but it's been an interesting process. So pretty different to my first font, that all caps one. For the script font, I had a lot of source material to work from. I've worked with reverse contrast script a lot. I love these letters, and I have so many ideas and things that I want to try out. But as I said before, you kind of have to pick and choose. And so even like figuring out, and sorry if I got the terminology wrong to all the serious type people, but where the stem like ends, like I was like, oh, it could be loopy like this little oat milk example, or it could be really thin and not have any additional weight, or it could be slightly angled, it could be really dramatic, it could even have a serif. Like the possibilities are all there. So even trying to nail that down needed a lot of exploration and testing and iteration before I could really decide. And so this font has been this really interesting challenge of how do I achieve a similar feeling to my lettering in a way that fits as a system. So trying to achieve a similar look, but with a very totally different design problem. So some of the specific examples that I'll share. So my lettering on the left here, like with the U, N, and Y, I will typically do like something a little like, loopy or wavy because, it's more fun that way. It's, again, adding that additional style and personality. But when it comes to the font, it just was not working. So really having to axe that, even though it was something that I wanted to have in that font, but it wasn't working. Another way that I wanted to kind of add this sense of like style or kind of openness in some of the letters was this here, which again, I had it for a long time, but as I kept doing proofs, it just wasn't working. And so I tested, okay, so what if I get rid of it? And it worked so much better. And so that was another example of something I had to kind of take away for the font to ultimately work. And here, in lettering, descenders can be a lot of fun. You can use them as a way to add a lot of like impact and drama and like just again additional flair. But with a font, you cannot do that unless it's maybe an alternate or ligature or something, because ultimately you have to think about, well, how tall is the descender going to be, because it's going to impact the line height that a designer can set it at. And you can't also, because it's reverse contrast, like you've got to have enough weight to bounce up the top, but you can't make it too long. You can't make it go too far to the left, because it's going to start colliding with other characters. And so it's just kind of, again, it's all of those little decisions that you have to really consider, which is really interesting. And the last example I will share is these. This was probably the toughest. With some of the counters, like I was experimenting with having these loopy, again, because in lettering it was something that I often did to add some character to it, or I would have it connect at a higher point with the O. And with the font, because at least the stage that I'm at, I'm trying to make all the connections hit exactly the same spot for every single letter. I couldn't really do that with the O. And I tried and experimented with having these loopy counters. So the loopy one is on the left. The one I ended up going with, which is more simple, is on the right. But it started adding this kind of added noise or like texture or this feeling that I wasn't really actually enjoying. And so even though when I was looking at them as individual letters, it looked nice, when I just stepped back and looked at it as a system, it wasn't really working. And I had to ask that. So in my kind of limited experience with type design, making fonts, I feel like designing a font is kind of the perfect creative challenge. It's maybe not for everybody, but I think it's this magical balance of style and expression, but with the practicalities and limitations of having to create a system. And so that kind of like tension between, well, you've built these rules that you want to apply across all these letters in your system, but sometimes you have to acknowledge that you have to break or change the rules in order to achieve the visual expression that you're actually trying to go for. So that's been really, really interesting. And so this is a little bit of a shameless plug. So the script font is going to come soon at some point, hopefully. Right now it's just the lowercase, but through all the experimenting and working on it, like it's finally getting to a place where I actually feel pretty excited about where it might land. So I just wanted to share that. So, if you're interested in it, stay tuned somehow on social media or a newsletter that I publish. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That is so great. I love that. I mean, I do think type design is kind of like, the ultimate visual puzzle, right? So it's really cool to hear about you take us through that and your experience with it. So does anyone have any questions, like either strategic questions about moving from lettering to type design, or maybe more tactical things about making the typeface itself? Yeah.
I'm curious how you balance like personal work, self-initiated projects with client work. Do you ever use client work to like initiate like a type design project?
I don't have enough bandwidth, I think, to have personal projects from client work. I wish I did. I think that's a great question, and I don't know if I have a great answer. I think basically, a lot of the client work does kind of spawn into, I think, inspiration for some of the projects that I work on. Like, for example, that first font was from a client project. But I think ultimately, I think I have more ideas than I really can balance. So I think it's just focusing on the ones that I really care about, so that I actually will finish them, because if I enjoy it, then that'll motivate me to actually do it. So I think that's the only thing that I've really found to be true in terms of balancing it. So yeah, don't know if I have a great answer for you there.
Hi,
All right, do we have one more question?
Hi. You do mural art, which looks really nice. So cool. Do you use lettering for your mural art, or is there sort of like you also use type design for your mural to as a base, as a template, or is it mainly lettering for your mural artwork?
It is most definitely lettering. So yeah, I think yeah, I did my mural. All of my murals are basically just like custom lettering that I've done, and so that's been what has worked. Yeah, and it's a lot of fun, and I think it makes it easier when it's something like a script because then the motions are a lot more natural. But yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much, Lisa. And so everyone should keep an eye on your social media and your website for when your script typeface is coming out. Thank you very much, Lisa.